He had everything: power, money, respect, until his heart stopped beating in the middle of his empire. And when he woke up, the only person left to save him was the woman whose life he'd destroyed. But this isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when the one you broke teaches you how to heal, because sometimes the hardest heartbeat is the one that dares to start again. The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence that precedes disaster. Alexander Reed stood at the head of the glass table, his reflection fractured by the city lights of Chicago behind him. His voice, once sharp and commanding, trembled as news anchors echoed his name in shame across every screen. His empire, Reed Financial Group, was collapsing faster than he could comprehend. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of something he couldn't control. Sweat dripped down his temple as he gripped the edge of the table. His breathing grew shallow, each heartbeat thundering in his ears. Faces blurred, voices merged into meaningless noise. Then the world tilted, his vision narrowed to a tunnel of light and sound before fading to nothing at all. When his body hit the floor, the mighty king of Chicago's financial world fell, and the room did nothing but stare. At the St. Augustine Medical Center, Nurse Grace Mitchell walked briskly through the night shift's quiet corridors. Her steps were soft, her expression calm, but her eyes carried years of exhaustion and unspoken pain. When the emergency call came, cardiac arrest, male, mid-50s, VIP patient, she didn't hesitate. It was just another life to save. At least, that's what she told herself. When they wheeled him in, Grace's gaze froze. She recognized the face, older, paler, but unmistakable. Alexander Reed, the man whose hospital cutbacks had once cost her husband his life. The irony was cruel and cold. Still, she placed her hand on his wrist, checking for a pulse that was barely there. Her duty was to heal, not to hate. The operating room became a storm of movement, doctors shouting, machines screaming, nurses running. Grace stood focused amidst the chaos, counting compressions under her breath. She saw his chest rise and fall, his heart flicker on the monitor like a dying flame. "Come on, Mr. Reed," she whispered softly. "Even kings don't die this easily." When the flatline turned to rhythm, the team exhaled in relief. Alexander's body stabilized, though barely. Grace stepped back, her hands trembling slightly, her mask damp with sweat. She told herself it was just adrenaline, not emotion, not history. Yet as they wheeled him to the private suite, something in her chest ached. Hours later, she sat by his bedside, charting vitals under the dim hospital light. He looked peaceful, almost human. The same man whose power once reached into every corner of the city now lay helpless before her. Grace wondered if fate had finally found its sense of justice. Still, she pulled the blanket higher, murmuring, "Rest, Mr. Reed. You'll need your strength." Outside, the winter wind howled against the glass. Chicago's skyline glittered like shards of ice, a reflection of the empire that had just fallen. In that sterile room, two lives had collided, one broken by arrogance, the other by consequence. Neither of them knew it yet, but redemption had just drawn its first breath. Grace turned off the bedside lamp and sat in the half-dark, watching the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was steady, almost defiant. She whispered a quiet prayer she didn't believe in anymore. Somewhere deep down, something told her this story was far from over. Chapter 2. The sleeping giant days turned into weeks. Alexander Reed lay still, unmoving, his body surviving on machines and routine. To the doctors, he was another high-profile patient. To Grace, he was a contradiction, a symbol of both tragedy and second chances. She attended to him diligently, changing dressings, adjusting IV lines, speaking softly though he could not hear. Nurses whispered about her strange dedication. "He doesn't deserve her kindness," one said. Grace ignored them. Maybe they were right. But she wasn't doing this for him. She was doing it for herself, for the part of her that still believed in compassion, even for the undeserving. Each day she walked in with the same quiet resolve, as though forgiveness itself were her medicine. The room smelled of antiseptic, and muted hope. Grace brought fresh flowers from home white lilies, her husband's favorite. She placed them near the window, beside the skyline view Alexander once owned. Sometimes she read aloud from the newspaper, her tone steady as if speaking to someone half listening. The headlines were cruel. Tycoon turns villain. Read Empire in ruins. Still, she read them. Truth, no matter how harsh, was better than silence. One night, as she adjusted his blanket, she caught sight of a photograph half hidden under his chart. It was of a woman, elegant, smiling, and hauntingly familiar. Grace's stomach tightened. The face belonged to Elizabeth Reed, Alexander's late wife and her former patient. She hadn't seen that face since the day Elizabeth died in her arms. Grace's mind spun. Memories surged the frantic night, the alarms, the desperate pleas for resources denied by corporate policy, by his policy. For a moment, bitterness returned, sharp and consuming. She had dreamed of this confrontation for years, yet here he was, unconscious, powerless, unable to hear a single accusation. Justice, she realized, had a cruel sense of timing. She spent the rest of the night sitting silently by his bed, wrestling with ghosts. Forgiveness had always seemed noble in theory until it had a face, a name, a pulse. Her eyes drifted to the monitor, to the rhythm of his heart, fragile but alive. "You don't get to die yet," she whispered. "Not before you see what you've done." Morning broke over Chicago, painting the hospital in pale gold. "Doctor," Ethan Collins entered with his usual warmth, greeting Grace with a small smile. He had known her for years enough to recognize the pain she tried to hide. "You've been spending too much time here," he said softly. "He's not your responsibility." Grace replied, "Maybe not, but he's my patient." After he left, Grace stood by the window, looking out over the frozen city. Somewhere in the chaos below, lives were still moving, deals were still being made, and hearts were still breaking. She wondered if Alexander's would ever learn to beat for something real again. And in the quiet, almost imperceptible, the slightest twitch crossed his fingers. The sleeping giant was beginning to stir. The morning light seeped through the blinds, painting thin gold lines across the sterile hospital walls. Grace was adjusting the IV drip when she noticed something strange. Alexander's fingers moved again, more deliberately this time. She froze, her breath caught halfway. Then, with a faint groan, his eyes flickered open, unfocused and heavy, as though waking from years of darkness. For a moment, he looked lost, a man stripped of power, memory, and pride. Confusion filled his gaze as he scanned the room. The machines, the scent of antiseptic, the faint sound of heart monitors, nothing made sense. "Where am I?" he rasped, his voice dry, broken. Grace leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "St. Augustine Medical Center, Mr. Reed. You've been unconscious for almost 3 months." His eyes widened slightly. 3 months? He repeated, disbelief sharpening his tone. The empire he once ruled must have burned to ash while he slept. His first instinct was command. "Get me my lawyer, my daughter, my..." He stopped when he saw Grace's expression steady, unflinching, almost pitying. "You should rest," she said softly. "There's a lot you don't know yet." But Alexander's pride was like a reflex, automatic and unyielding. "How you don't understand who I am," he growled. Grace met his eyes and replied, "I understand exactly who you are." Later that day, doctors filled him in. The company was bankrupt, his assets frozen. His daughter had taken control. Each word hit harder than the last. Grace watched from the corner, expression unreadable as he struggled to process the truth. The mighty titan was gone, only a frail, aging man remained. Yet somewhere in his brokenness, she sensed the faintest spark of something human. When she left his room that evening, Grace paused by the door. Behind her, Alexander sat staring at his hands that once signed billion-dollar deals, now trembling over hospital sheets. His voice was a whisper, meant for no one. "What have I done?" She didn't answer. She only watched the snow fall outside and thought, maybe now he's ready to feel. The days that followed were filled with tension sharp enough to cut the air. Alexander hated feeling weak, and he hated even more that his strength meant nothing here. Grace was the only one who didn't bow to his name. When he snapped orders, she calmly ignored them. When he demanded silence, she spoke anyway. Her defiance wasn't loud, it was quiet, deliberate, and disarming. One afternoon, as she adjusted his pillow, he said bitterly, "Do you enjoy seeing me like this? The great Alexander Reed helpless." Grace didn't flinch. "I don't enjoy anyone's pain, Mr. Reed. I just don't believe you're as great as you think." For a moment, their eyes locked, arrogance meeting empathy, guilt meeting grace. Then she turned away, leaving him speechless in a silence he couldn't command. That night, he overheard two nurses whispering outside his room. "He deserves every bit of this," one said. "People lost everything because of him." The words hit him harder than he expected. When Grace stepped in, she noticed his expression, not anger, but shame. "You heard them," she said quietly. He nodded once. "And they're right." For the first time, he didn't defend himself. Later, she found him watching the city lights through the window. "You ever think people can change?" he asked, voice low, uncertain. Grace hesitated before answering. "People can break. And sometimes, that's what makes them change." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close to understanding. When she left the room, Alexander followed her with his eyes. For the first time since waking, he didn't see her as a nurse. He saw her as a mirror, one that reflected the man he was and the man he might still become. Outside, Chicago's wind roared, but inside that room, something softer was beginning to stir, the faint rhythm of redemption. The hospital was quiet that night, the kind of silence that made every heartbeat feel louder. Grace was tidying Alexander's room when she noticed a worn leather folder resting on the bedside table. Curiosity hesitated before compassion did. She opened it carefully and found a single photograph inside Elizabeth Reed, smiling radiantly, her eyes filled with warmth. Grace's breath caught. She remembered those eyes. She remembered the night they closed forever. The memory hit like a wave, alarms blaring, nurses shouting, her hands trembling as she tried to save a woman pleading for help. Grace had begged for resources that never came, denied by budget cuts signed by Alexander himself. That night, Elizabeth Reed died while the world outside toasted her husband's empire. Grace pressed the photograph to her chest, her jaw tight. The past had come full circle, and fate had an impeccable sense of cruelty. The next morning, she avoided his gaze. Every touch, every word felt heavier now, weighted by truth unspoken. Alexander, unaware, tried to recover pieces of himself, relearning to walk, regaining strength. He mistook her quietness for fatigue, not knowing it was restraint. Grace wanted to hate him, but hate had become too exhausting to carry. One evening, as she adjusted his IV, he asked softly, "Do I know you from somewhere?" The question froze her hands. "No," she said after a pause, her voice steady but cold. He watched her leave, sensing a shadow in her tone he couldn't name. For the first time, he wondered if the nurse saving his life was hiding something she couldn't forgive. That night, Grace stood outside under the hospital's neon glow, watching snow swirl under streetlights. The city moved on, uncaring, but her heart pulsed with memories she couldn't bury. "You don't remember," she whispered to the wind. "But I do." Somewhere above, in a private suite, Alexander Reed slept peacefully, unaware that the woman guarding his second chance was the ghost of his first mistake. The next week brought storms outside and within. Grace was changing Alexander's bandages when the door opened, and a woman entered, sharp heels clicking like a metronome of power. Emily Reed. Her presence filled the room with frost. She looked at her father not with affection, but calculation. "You look smaller," she said flatly. Grace felt the chill even before Alexander spoke her name. Emily's smile was thin, polished, corporate. She spoke about liquidation, damage control, and public image, as if her father were a business asset to manage, not a man recovering from collapse. Grace watched silently, noticing the subtle disgust in Emily's tone. It wasn't grief, it was hunger. She wanted control, not closure. And in Alexander's frailty, she saw her opportunity. After Emily left, the room felt colder. Alexander stared at the window, the glass fogged from his breath. "She's not like her mother," he murmured half to himself. Grace replied quietly, "No, she isn't." He turned to her, searching her face, but she looked away. Emily's visit had left more than tension, it had stirred guilt in him, and suspicion in Grace. That evening, Emily met privately with the hospital board, arguing that her father's care was unnecessary and too expensive. Grace overheard the conversation and felt her stomach twist. It wasn't about money, it was about control. Emily wanted him declared incompetent, unable to interfere in her plans. Grace realized then that the Reed Empire's corruption didn't die with its scandal, it had inherited a new face. When Grace returned to Alexander's room, he was asleep, his breathing steady but uneasy. She stood beside his bed, her reflection mingling with his in the glass. "Your daughter's not here to save you," she whispered softly. "But I will be, until you're strong enough to see who really wants you gone." And though he couldn't hear her, his hand twitched again as if his heart already knew. Grace barely slept that week. Emily's presence haunted every hallway like a shadow made of perfume and poison. The board was leaning toward her proposal to move Alexander into private care, far from Grace's supervision. She knew what that meant: control, silence, and eventual disappearance. Grace couldn't let it happen, but she also couldn't reveal why she cared so much. The truth would destroy everything. Alexander grew restless, asking daily about his company, his assets, his name. Grace avoided answers, knowing how fragile his recovery was. But one evening, she found him scrolling through news headlines on a tablet. Each headline cut deeper: Reed Financial declared insolvent. Daughter assumes control. Alexander Reed, from titan to tragedy. His expression hardened as he muttered, "She's finishing what I started." Grace heard it: guilt, not anger. That night she returned to his room to find him awake, eyes open in the dark. "Why do you stay?" he asked quietly. "You don't owe me anything." Grace hesitated, words trembling between truth and self-defense. "Because someone has to care," she said finally. "And maybe you need to see what that looks like." She left before he could respond, but the silence that followed was heavier than any answer. Outside, the city roared with life cars, sirens, 1,000 stories unfolding without mercy. Grace walked home under falling snow, her heart split between compassion and resentment. She wondered what forgiveness would even look like for someone like Alexander. Could redemption truly exist for the man who once chose profit over lives? Or was she only fooling herself, chasing the ghost of the good she wanted to see? The next morning, Grace made her decision. She'd find proof of what Emily was planning and stop her before it was too late. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth. And for the first time since her husband's death, Grace felt the kind of purpose that didn't come from pain, but from power. Grace moved through the hospital like a ghost, quiet but determined. She began gathering information, overheard conversations, printed memos, whispers between administrators. What she uncovered confirmed her fears. Emily planned to transfer her father to a private facility under the guise of special care, effectively cutting him off from the outside world. It was not medical protection, it was imprisonment. Meanwhile, Alexander tried to piece together the fragments of his life. Physical therapy left him exhausted, but he pushed through, driven by pride and denial. Yet when he looked at the reflection in the mirror, gaunt face, trembling hands, he saw a stranger. The man who once ruled the skyline of Chicago was now a relic of his own arrogance. And still, when Grace entered the room, he straightened, as if her presence demanded something better from him. One afternoon, she confronted him. "Emily's trying to take everything," she said firmly. "She's planning to move you somewhere isolated." He stared at her, shock flickering beneath disbelief. "She wouldn't," he whispered. Grace met his eyes. "She already has the papers ready." The silence that followed was sharp as glass. For the first time, Alexander understood the full extent of the empire he had created. and the monster it had raised. That night, he sat by the window in his wheelchair, staring at the city lights. "Everything I built was supposed to protect her," he said softly. Grace replied, "You built walls, not homes." The words struck him deeper than he let show. She wasn't scolding him. She was mourning what could have been. In that moment, he saw her not as an employee, but as someone who still believed humanity was worth saving. Grace left him with a plan forming in her mind. She couldn't erase the past, but she could stop history from repeating itself. As the snow fell heavier outside, she whispered to herself, "No one's going to bury him alive, not again." And though she didn't realize it yet, Alexander Reed, once a symbol of corruption, was finally beginning to listen. Grace could no longer carry the weight of silence. Every day she saw Alexander trying, failing, and trying again, struggling to stand, to remember, to matter. The guilt she'd buried for years gnawed at her. One evening, she found him reading old company reports, tracing the numbers that had once made him powerful. "You don't need those anymore," she said softly. "They broke you once." His reply was a whisper. "They built me first." Her throat tightened. "They destroyed others too." Alexander looked up, eyes tired but sharp. "You speak as if you knew them." Grace's composure fractured. "I did," she said quietly. "Your wife, Elizabeth Reed. I was her nurse." The silence that followed stretched endlessly. His face went pale. "You," his voice trembled. "You were there." Grace nodded, tears brimming. "I was the one holding her hand when she died." He turned away, gripping the bed frame as if to keep himself from falling apart. "Why didn't you say anything?" he demanded, his voice cracking between anger and grief. "Because you wouldn't have listened," she said, steady but trembling. "You were too powerful to hear anyone back then." The words pierced him. For years, he had blamed the system, the policies, the paperwork, but never himself. Now, for the first time, he saw the faces behind the statistics. Grace continued, her voice breaking. "I wanted to hate you. I did. But every day I saw you here weak, broken, I realized you were just another casualty of your own empire. So I stayed, not for forgiveness, for truth." Her confession was both punishment and mercy. Alexander covered his face with shaking hands. "I don't deserve it," he whispered. Grace replied, "That's not the point. You just have to face it." When she left the room, he didn't stop her. The sound of her footsteps faded into the quiet hum of machines. Alone, Alexander let the tears fall for his wife, for the empire, for the man he used to be. Outside, the city's lights flickered through the snow like a heartbeat in the dark. For the first time, Alexander Reed wasn't running from guilt. He was learning to live with it. The next morning, Grace entered the archives beneath the hospital, her heart pounding with both fear and conviction. She'd overheard Emily's assistant mention an off-site server containing confidential records that could expose more than financial fraud. If the truth about Elizabeth's death was buried there, she was going to find it. Dust rose as she pried open an old cabinet labeled Reed Medical Division, private. The smell of old paper and ink filled the air. Hours passed as she combed through files. Most were routine reports, budget sheets, contracts, medical supply orders. But then she found it. A report marked confidential. Patient 4187, Elizabeth Reed. Inside, her hands shook as she read the signature, not Alexander's, but Emily's. The order to deny emergency equipment approval had come from the daughter, not the father. Her stomach twisted. Elizabeth's death had been no accident. It was ambition disguised as bureaucracy. Grace copied the files and hid the originals, heart racing. When she returned upstairs, she found Alexander waiting by the window, staring at the snow-covered skyline. His eyes turned to her. "You found something," he said quietly. She handed him the folder, saying only, "Read it." He opened it with trembling hands, scanning each line until his face drained of color. "No," he muttered. "It can't be." But it could, and it was. He looked up at her, devastation clear in his eyes. "My daughter did this." Grace nodded, tears threatening. You didn't kill your wife, Alexander. She did. He collapsed into the chair, burying his face in his hands. For years he had carried guilt like a sentence, and now the truth was worse than punishment. It was betrayal. I built her world, he whispered, and she used it to destroy her mother. Grace placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Then build something better, she said softly, for her memory, not her mistakes. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the city glowed under the pale winter sun. For the first time, Alexander didn't feel crushed by what he'd lost, but by what he'd finally seen. The truth, raw and unfiltered, had set him free, and it was time to make it mean something. The following days felt like walking on thin ice. Alexander spent hours staring at the documents Grace had given him, his mind replaying decades of choices. Every deal, every signature, every sacrifice, all of it had led here. Grace watched from a distance, unsure whether to comfort him or let him break. She knew sometimes people needed to shatter before they could rebuild, but what she didn't expect was what he said next. "Help me expose her." Grace blinked. "Expose Emily?" she asked carefully. "She's your daughter." His gaze was firm, colder than she'd ever seen. "She stopped being my daughter the moment she chose greed over life." The words carried no anger, only grief, the quiet kind that carves deeper wounds than rage ever could. Grace nodded slowly. "Then we do it right," she said. "No vengeance, just truth." He agreed, but something in his eyes hinted at old instincts the businessman who once knew how to destroy. Together, they began collecting evidence. Grace reached out to Dr. Ethan Collins, who reluctantly agreed to help, though he warned, "You're risking everything." She answered simply, "Some things are worth the risk." Ethan smuggled out digital copies of Reed Financial's medical contracts, proving widespread negligence. Meanwhile, Alexander reached out to old allies, journalists, auditors, former partners, planting the seeds of his confession. The machine that had once served his corruption now moved toward redemption. Late one night, Grace found him struggling to write a statement. His hands shook, his voice weak. "Every word feels like blood," he admitted. She placed her hand gently over his. "Then bleed the truth. It's the only thing that heals." He looked at her, a flicker of gratitude softening the lines on his face. For the first time, she saw not the tycoon, but the man-flawed, broken human. And he saw her not as a nurse, but as the soul who'd brought him back from the dead. When they finished, dawn crept over Chicago's skyline, brushing gold over the snow-covered rooftops. Alexander sealed the envelope with trembling fingers. "Tomorrow," he said, voice steady, "we tell the world what we've done." Grace nodded, exhaustion mixing with quiet pride. Redemption, she realized, wasn't loud. It was whispered between two people brave enough to face the ruin together. The next morning, the boardroom of Reed Financial buzzed with tension. Emily sat at the head of the table, poised, confident, every inch her father's successor. The door opened, and silence fell as Alexander entered, thinner, older, but carrying the same presence that once made cities kneel. Grace followed behind him, calm and unreadable. Emily's smirk faltered. "You shouldn't be here," she said sharply. "You're finished." Alexander's voice was calm. "You're right. I am finished, and I'm taking you with me." He placed the files on the table, their edges perfectly aligned, as if order could tame the chaos within. "These documents prove what you did," he said evenly. "You authorized the cuts that killed your mother. You signed the cover-ups, and you turned this company into a weapon." Gasps rippled across the room. Emily's face went pale. "You can't prove any of it," she hissed, but her voice trembled. Grace stepped forward, her tone steady as glass. "Every signature has a digital trail. Every order was recorded, and we've already sent copies to the press." Emily's mask-cracked rage flashed in her eyes, but underneath it was fear. "You think this makes you a hero?" she spat at her father. "You destroyed everything." Alexander met her gaze, sadness in his tone. "Yes, and now I'm finally doing something right." Security entered moments later, called by someone unseen. Reporters waited outside the building, cameras ready. Alexander turned to Grace. "It's time," he said quietly. Then, facing the press, he confessed everything: the corruption, the greed, the deaths, his own blindness. "This empire was built on arrogance," he declared, "and it ends today with truth." The crowd erupted, flashes blinding, voices roaring. Grace stood behind him, tears she refused to shed burning in her eyes. As they left the building together, the sky began to snow again. Reporters shouted, cameras followed, but Alexander seemed lighter than before. "You've ruined yourself," Grace whispered as they walked. He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I've saved something more important." She looked at him, confused. "What's that?" His answer was simple: "My soul." And for the first time, she believed him. The world devoured the confession. Within hours, every news network in the country carried Alexander Reed's name again, this time not as a mogul, but as a criminal. Grace watched the chaos unfold from her small apartment, her phone buzzing non-stop with reporters' calls. She had expected fallout, but not the ferocity of it. The public loved redemption stories, but they loved watching a man fall even more. At the hospital, whispers filled the corridors. Some called Grace brave, others called her naive. The board placed her on immediate suspension, citing unauthorized data retrieval. She didn't fight it. She had known this would come. What hurt most wasn't the job, it was watching her name slowly dragged through the same mud she had pulled Alexander from. Justice, it seemed, never arrived clean. Meanwhile, Alexander faced the storm head-on. The court hearings were relentless, the prosecutors merciless. He refused lawyers, choosing to represent himself. Every word he spoke was an admission, every sentence a confession. The media painted him as both villain and martyr. "If this is what it takes to cleanse what I built," he said in court, "then let me burn." Grace watched from afar, torn between pride and heartbreak. One evening, she visited him in the detention ward. The walls were bare, the air heavy. He looked older than she remembered, frail but strangely at peace. "You shouldn't have come," he said softly. "You warned me once," she replied. "Now it's my turn." She handed him a small folded paper, a photo of Elizabeth. "For when you forget why you started this." His eyes glistened, and for the first time he couldn't speak. As she left, the guard locked the door behind her with a metallic click that echoed down the corridor. Grace walked away slowly, her reflection fading in the sterile glass. Outside, the city was drenched in rain instead of snow. Each droplet hit the pavement like a heartbeat, steady, persistent. Chicago was cleansing itself, one storm at a time. Months passed. The city forgot his name, as cities often do. Reed Financial was dismantled, its assets sold, its skyscraper renamed. But from its ashes rose something unexpected: the Elizabeth Foundation for Medical Reform. Grace stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, her hands trembling slightly as she took in the sight. The foundation's mission was simple: to provide care for those who couldn't afford it. And though his name was gone, his legacy had changed shape. She hadn't seen Alexander since the trial. He was serving a reduced sentence for cooperation, and though she had written to him, no reply ever came. Yet every month, the foundation received anonymous donations, large, consistent, and always accompanied by a single note: "Keep healing them." Grace never needed a signature to know who it was from. Some things could only be written in redemption. Dr. Ethan Collins returned as chief medical advisor, offering Grace her position back. "Jove rebuilt what they tried to destroy," he said with quiet admiration. She smiled faintly. "No, Ethan, we just remembered what medicine is supposed to be." He looked at her for a long moment, realizing the woman before him was no longer fragile. The Grace he'd known timid, wounded, was gone. In her place stood something unbreakable. That evening she walked through the new hospital wing, tracing the walls with her fingertips. Laughter echoed from the recovery rooms, a sound she hadn't heard in years. For the first time she felt peace, not the hollow kind born from forgetting, but the real one, born from surviving. She paused by the window, watching the city lights glow against the night sky. Then she saw an envelope slipped under her office door, no return address. Inside was a small check and a single handwritten sentence: "Some hearts still beat for you." She pressed the note to her chest, smiling through tears. Somewhere out there, beyond the walls and the noise, redemption had a heartbeat, and it was still alive. Spring arrived quietly in Chicago, melting the last traces of winter's cold. The city seemed softer now, slower, as if exhaling after months of tension. Grace walked through the Foundation's garden, where patients and families sat under blooming cherry trees. Every petal that drifted to the ground reminded her of how fragile and beautiful survival could be. The air carried laughter, the kind born not from comfort, but from hope. She had built a new rhythm for her life. Early mornings at the Foundation, late evenings writing progress reports and answering donor letters. Yet one envelope remained unopened, the one she received months ago, with that single line, "Some hearts still beat for you." She kept it inside her journal, not out of longing but gratitude. It was proof that even broken hearts could find a way to keep time. One afternoon, a delivery arrived at her office, a small box with no name, only an address: Riverside Rehabilitation Center, Illinois. Inside was a photograph. It showed a garden not unlike hers, filled with white lilies, and a man sitting by a window, sunlight touching his face. On the back of the photo, a single phrase was written in neat handwriting: "Healing isn't the absence of pain, it's learning to grow around it." Her eyes filled with quiet tears. Grace smiled, tracing the words with her fingertips. She could almost hear his voice, steady, humble, changed. She imagined Alexander walking among the lilies, tending them with the same patience she now gave her patients. Two people who once broke each other, now mending the world in different corners of it. Forgiveness hadn't erased the past, it had transformed it into something softer, something worth living for. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, Grace stepped outside and looked toward the horizon. The city buzzed around her, restless and alive. She closed her eyes, feeling the pulse beneath her skin, her own heart, steady and strong. "Some hearts never stop beating," she whispered to the wind. And somewhere miles away, a man looked up at the same sunset, smiling, as if he'd heard her. In the end, some hearts don't break, they change. Grace found her strength, Alexander found his redemption, and somewhere between forgiveness and truth, they both learned how to live again. If this story touched you, let your heart speak. Leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and don't forget to subscribe because every story deserves to be heard.